Thank you very much. One brief correction at the beginning. Even if I wanted to teach Latin, I have not the experience or the skill, of course, but I do have experience in attempts at teaching liberal arts in grammar, dialectics, and oratory. And I have been asked to discuss this experience, or on the basis of this experience. When I worked on this intervention, I realized that in some way, when teachers hear about education, classical education, from others, at least that's what how I experience this, they ask themselves a question, how? And the answer to that question is relatively simple in my opinion. It is so simple that if I were to present it to you today, right now, we could come to an end of this presentation. And some would be happy because lunch would come, but the organizer would not necessarily be as elated. So before that answer to the question comes, I'd like to lead you through a series of reflections around the liberal arts. Because when I speak about classical education, I refer to education based on liberal arts. And this is the trivium in my experience. When we speak about liberal arts or conceptualizing art techne as free, which does justice to its natures, fraught with at least two paradoxalities. First, conceptualization presupposes abstraction and timelessness, while the key element of art is experience, empeireia, as Aristotle defines it in the beginning of Metaphysica. Something that is necessarily stretched over time and presupposes engagement of action of the body and senses. Secondly, perception of art as liberated, which is not undertaken because of some external benefit, but because they constitute good in themselves, seems to be accessible only for those who have already tasted art itself and its benefits, which in turn would rather be vain in telling about it. But however, we feel that this paradoxicality must be overcome, because art is one of those fields in which man's reasonableness is revealed, distinguishing it from other animals. Because experience, which is the condition of creation of art, is based on conscious repetition of certain action and memorization of it. The opposite of experience, on the other hand, is chance. Hence the scholastic definition of art as recta ratio factibilium, which is difficult to translate. And this is rationality and this effort in action and creation. So this presupposes improvement and proper action. So this is art which is not exempt from the law of aforementioned paradoxicality. Now, the genius of Greeks consisted, among others, in their intuitive ability to overcome this through such a use of words as to include action. So Iliad, in full, considers expresses this somehow, where Odysseus, after wanderings, ends with his arrival in the court of Phoenicians, and then he is transported in a magical ship to his home. The Aoida de Modo precedes book 8, and when we listen to the song, Odysseus cannot hold his feelings when the Modoc sings about the events of Troy and about the works of Ithaca. And when listening to this with pleasure, Odysseus is influenced by the words and relives the hardships and mourns his lost friends. I remember this literary image because it provides good illustration of the topic under discussion. We are actually now gathered at a symposium. Homer demonstrates difference between listeners lacking experience and Odysseus, the listener who is experienced in what the words are about. There is a contrast between Domitius and Demodoc, who is a blind person. Blind, therefore, necessarily taken out of the sphere of action. Homer carefully emphasizes this in the scene. He is always brought in by ushers every time and cannot move on his own. And he is, even though he is identified by Odysseus as the divine messenger of the Muses. And then for the next 4 books, the Odysseus will then relate his experiences. So now, inspired Aoida, it provides a tale. Author of Odyssey, in a sense, cuts the distance between word and action. Without the songs of Demodocs, there would not be the stories of Odysseus or his happy return home. Finally, last detail. The Odysseus' return journey takes place in a dream, completely outside of the realm of words, as if Homer was trying to tell us that that action is not subject to verbalization. Greeks demonstrate this in Gordias, who demonstrates Gordias in his praise of Helen of Troy, logos dynestes megas estin. In other words, there is this power of unconsidered views that a listener comes into. Before I move to example from textbooks on the arts, let me just mention Plato, who added another voice to Sophist's approach and thus creating Greek polyphony. Plato was not confident about power of words, and he saw weakness rather than strength in the words of transmitted. So he goes back to pre-existence of the soul and non-verbal action of the mind. Author of dialogues is a master of heuresis. How words can preserve the memory of art is a question for us today, where our culture was almost completely stricken by amnesia. The lexicon of classical education is still present in our vocabulary, but to reach out to the original meanings, we do need some form of overcoming this amnesia. When studying aphorism, I realized that Hippocrates was the father of the genre. The work, collection of short statements, starts with something that Latin translates into ars longa, vita brevis. My astonishment stemmed from the fact that I understood this in Horatian terms. And I always encountered Schopenhauerian interpretation, the contrasting, immortalizing power of art and fragility of transience of life. However, interpretation doesn't make much sense. Aphorism was uttered by a doctor to convey medical experience to future medical students. When we say art, when we think about the work of art, in the context of arts, the artist is not the important, but the actual piece of art which survives. And it is unique, it is original and unique. So cannot be transferred in terms of being able to produce exactly the same type of art. Whereas Hippocrates wishes to transfer something. As he says, experience is brief, life is brief, it's important for the doctor not to cut it further short based on their own mistakes in their brief life. So art is longer than life because it has experience of many generations. It's no longer individual experience, but can be transferred through generations. Example of Hippocrates, it works on our imagination. If I were to ask, I would like to be learning, be medicated by the author of aphorisms from Kos, the island of Kos. It's obvious that aphorisms of Hippocrates can be understood only by those who are engaged in the art of medicine. So the reader is forced to reflect. So it's more important to understand what is not in the text, but it's already in the reader's mind, rather than what the text already contains. A reader might be ignorant of the art. The same is true with the classical art liberalis textbooks, such as Quintilian's oratory, speaker's art. The scope of topics is only a list because of their usefulness. If someone were to treat this as a ready educational tool and to conduct readings or a lesson based on this, he will be, in a sense, for loss of words. If you are, the assumption being that if you are teaching, then you are the one already teaching, then you should know the content, and author of this textbook only points to accents and key topics. The liberal arts in Tridium appears from nowhere, but in its mature form, it comes through Aristotle. Further synthesis in later authors. The only way to enter in dialogue with a textbook is to follow the path that is pointed to. Say the postcards from a trail. As an introductory grammatical experience, Quintilian introduces explanation of archaisms, solecism, barbarisms, and such subjective linguistic phenomena present in poetry. Now, why do we expose children to work with difficult texts containing expressions that deviate from the norm? Why do we work on text written a couple of hundred of years ago in a language that's difficult to understand? Well, we need to provide a given phenomenon in a context that will bring out the characteristic, so that the work with the task that is to some extent understandable, but with various differences, will help entrench the classical norm and point to the development of language. You can look at archaisms to understand all of the key aspects of speech: syntax, semantics, phonetics, inflection, vocabulary. So students are dealing with these difficult, otherwise students will ignore the passages that are incomprehensible to them. Students would have difficulty in correctly transcribe the definition of a term from a textbook because they simply could not catch the meaning, or made no sense, the meaning. Quintilian's advice points to the fact that you expose them to hardships of dealing with a text that is certainly difficult to understand. You do not need tools of descriptive grammar to understand a simple sentence spoken in everyday life. But with the difficult passage, without these tools, you cannot cope. So the students learned that they can be directly problem solving can be needs to be applied. Quintilian also points to in Lessons of Rhetoric to analysis of styles. Based on the 3 books, you can conduct introductory course of rhetoric or oratory, not just rhetorical thinking, viewing text as the persuasion between the speaker and the reader, but also to solidify basic concepts such as motive, argument, stake, and counter-argument. A good thought, Athena appears to Achilles, suggesting him in a word instead of a sword, and allegory of a good speaker in the scene of Agamemnon. Let's remember that we are dealing with students after a course of grammar. So archaic poetry translation should not be a barrier. Of course, difficulty of a slow, non-selective reading with commentary and paraphrasing is useful because they discover this with the teacher and give it proper names and overcome habits resulting from information overload. Finally, rhetorical exercises there is a Polish translation of Progrima Smata prepared by Henryk Podbielski in Polish. So the exercises there are detailed and described more extensively. There are many, however, elements that you have to reach through the work, preferably through work with a student. Let me focus on the first one, a fairy tale. We know that this, in terms of definition, this is a false tale with a true instruction. You can use the guidelines of how to paraphrase, extend, and evaluation. There are basic questions such as how can truth arise from untruth? Allegory, in which there are animal fable or natural or conventional ways. Paraphrase explains what is the moral coming from it. There is a extension of the plot to strengthen the message of the tale. When you work in fables of Phaedrus, we note that they are uneven in terms of composition, allegory, and other. And the more I used them, I understood that this was a deliberate approach. Now, I was also surprised at the ingenuity and brilliance of students who expanded on this because they found various flaws in the text. Students of all years were always convinced that evaluations are only subjective expressions of teacher. Now, plot, allegory, and model can be evaluated individually. We are looking at if we are to understand how art is to be used and interpreted, we need to embark on that journey. So that's a brief description of the path one can follow. If you follow the classical pathways presented by classics. Now, rational exploration. We are not conducting another teaching experiment that will offer instant solutions. We are entering a road that 2,500 of years have been treaded by teachers and students. This is not about reconstructing historical method. Classical education is not gnosis, and school should not turn into a reconstruction group. Every art has rational component. Otherwise, it would be activity based on chance. But arts and crafts are more screened by rationality, and those that are less subject to rationalization. The more rational the art, the more mental the work, the more rational the art. The more liberated the art, the more universal its principles. There are things that humanity has forgotten irrevocably, but in case of liberal arts, we can be confident that mind trained in argumentation will work in similar ways today as it worked in the 13th century Paris or 4th century Athens. For the same reason, many good teachers in their daily work apply the skills that are part and parcel of liberal arts, although they may not even be calling that for themselves. Classical education, which refers to liberal arts, is indeed a proposal to get on the road, proven, tried and tested. Ars longa, vita brevis. Let's summarize. Firstly, the only way to value the liberal arts is to actually practice them. Demodoc's songs are important. The memory will not survive. But Odysseus's are also important, who can go on a journey and leave their habits, as they will be the ones that understand the songs. These are not long, short journeys, even though many of these pathways have been overcome, where 100 years ago in the United States that these pathways have been rediscovered. John's College in 1937 started a program, but 18 years later was their curriculum and syllabus published. Before us, lots of work, such as adaptation of rhetorical and grammatical exercises into Polish, and of course remembering of the original meanings of words. But that happens in the course, on the way, so to speak. The change from a listener who is enamored by the song of Demodoc, which is not a typical solution, from that position to active Odysseus is not so simple. In the world that defines itself as liberal, it is the free actions that are least undertaken, those undertaken without the necessity behind them. This is what the classical education assumes. This character of education based on tradition of liberal art means that it's not another proposal for revolution in education, but what the Greeks referred to as metanoia, overcoming and changing the conditions. If metanoia doesn't assume replacement of existing institutions, but rather perfection of the human being and thus improvement of the institutions around that they create. It's not just the students who are in the process of education, but teachers and parents who are responsible for that process. But we can hope for, in a sense, change of the attitudes of the students in the process. And finally, something that I've intended implicita in my statements, the answer to the question of whether it's doable and whether it's worth it. Well, both I would answer in the positive, but we will need to do in Ithaca, in our Ithaca.